When I first returned from New Orleans, I continued to process what I had experienced sitting at that table with my white relatives. And I started to think, this is an important story that might really need to be told more broadly. So I shared my experiences with a colleague, Charles Monroe-Kane, and he loved it. He said, Alex, I want to help you tell this story. And so the episode that you're about to listen to first appeared on his program. It's called To the Best of Our Knowledge in the spring of 2018. It's a Peabody award-winning national show on public radio. It's distributed by PRX. But after doing the interview with Charles Monroe-Kane, who was the interviewer and producer, I realized I had merely told the experience of meeting John and Joan and others, but I didn't really tell the whole story of what this means for America, what this means for American history, and what this might have to say with how we move ahead with the understanding of race relations and racial healing. I think you're going to find this episode particularly insightful. I've always been interested in genealogy. It's always intrigued me to know where my family name came from. My entire life I've been asked, where does G come from?
So he started digging around.
My great-great-grandfather was born a slave. His name was Henderson. And so about a year ago, I Googled his name and through Ancestry.com, and I found out that his father's name was Reuben Joshua G.
But here's the kicker. The relatives Alex G. found are white. He discovered that he's part white as well.
I found a post from a gentleman named John who basically said, I just found out that my great-great-grandfather had a black son. Does anyone know anything about Henderson G? And I thought, wait a minute, this is my grandfather's grandfather. And I wrote this guy about midnight. When I woke up the next morning, I had something in my inbox explaining who he was and who we were to each other, and that's how the discussion began.
And that discussion turned into a trip for Reverend Alex G. He and a couple of family members headed from Wisconsin down to New Orleans to meet his white cousin, John Harkin.
Roast beef gravy, all those are like the specialty.
Oh, that's great.
That's good for as long as we eat it.
Did you know that the G's, before they ended up in England and Wales, came from France? The name was Guy, G-U-I.
So the roots were in France?
Yeah, it was probably before 1500. We know they were in England and Wales in 1500. There's the G cross. That's a landmark over there.
Really?
Yeah.
If you were looking at G's American family tree, it'd go like this. At the top, the patriarch, Reuben G., plantation owner, slave owner. His first son, R.L. G., was born to his white wife. But his second son, Henderson G., was born to another woman, a woman he owned. And that son was born black and enslaved. Now, this story is not so unusual. Especially in the age of genetic ancestry testing, root seeking is more popular than ever. In this hour, what are the consequences of discovering the history of slavery written in your own bloodline? Does it open the door to new questions about racial justice and social healing? Well, those are all questions Alex G. had in mind when he headed south to meet his white relatives. Charles Monroe-Kane wanted to know what that was like.
You went down with your sister and your daughter, right?
That's right. And then one of my interns.
Yeah. So when you got there, for you, all of you, what was it like when you saw your first white relative?
Charles, it was surreal. I'm a public speaker. I'm always thrust into situations where I need to think on my feet. But I was nervous. We flew to New Orleans and got in about 10 o'clock Friday night. We Ubered over to his place that morning. I was afraid of what I would feel. Would it be awkward? Would he be distant? Would I be angry? When I walked up to the porch, he opened the door and he hugged me. He said, well, Cousin Alex. And it's like this older white guy in his early 70s and hugged me and invited my whole family into his home.
So, after we eat, we'll go upstairs We've got more coffee. We've got Coke Zero and Dr. Pepper. And
You like the Dr. Pepper?
so we'll take a drink break, then go back and have another little session.
Yeah.
You luckily have audio of your, and I spent a good 6-7 hours listening to all of it.
My father used to tell me his father, who was Oscar, had a white uncle. We just thought he meant very fair skin.
No,
and he said they had blue eyes.
That would be our great-great-grandfather.
He talked about a guy named Thomas.
Thomas G. He would be our grandmother's brother. I've told Joan, I really think there was a silent conspiracy not to mention Henderson and what went on back when.
I bet.
I'll bet our grandmother knew.
I bet a lot of people knew.
Oh, they knew. They knew.
The G's were old South plantation aristocracies. They had a lot of land, and they were living the more gone with the wind type life. They had the big home, and they had the silver that they hid in the well during the Civil War, and they held slaves, and there was Henderson born within this family, and right at the same time that Reuben was having his white children, then Henderson was born too. That is Beulah, and this is Robert Lafayette, who would have been Henderson's half-brother. There's a real relationship in terms of looks. I'm sure you see it.
Just the shape of his head and ears, hairline, it reminds me a lot of Henderson's photo.
Yeah.
Henderson was a slave.
Right.
His mother, Venus, was a slave. His father, Henderson's father, was her owner and his owner. I look at those photos and I think, how do you feel about your white bloodline?
That's the piece that made the trip surreal, because my G name, and I'm proud of my name, and I work hard in the community. I try to, it's a reputable name. But my name comes from the gentleman who owned and raped my great-great-great-grandmother. And so I have to keep wrestling with that. The name I try to defend, the name that I try to redeem, comes from this Welsh slave owner, and that blood is in me. That's something I'm still reconciling. I'm still wrestling with. And I think that's what kept my heart racing that entire day. We sat and we met. I didn't know how to reconcile the two.
You grew up with the pressures and the prejudices of being a black man in America, but now you're also white. Does that change your identity for you to know?
No, because this is American history. I don't know any African Americans who don't have white blood in them. I think what makes this so unique is knowing the people who are descendants. We have the same blood in us, but we have different stories.
John, how old are the homes in this community?
Most of these, like this one, was 1861. It's a great house.
These aren't 13-foot ceilings. That's at least like 15 feet.
13.
Is it?
Yep.
Oh, it looks high.
It looks higher than 13.
Yeah.
But I'm going to take you up to my library, which is really my favorite room, because that's where the real family antiques are.
It's apparent and clear how, not easy, but how much easier the white side of the G family had it after Reconstruction. Do you feel the black G's are owed something?
I think about that when I see road signs named G, and I see that it was a well-known name. I mean, G grocery store is sort of like the Quick Trip in that community. That's where people in that part of Lee County go for their groceries and gas, and then there's a laundry store next door. Then I consider the fact that my father was a sharecropper. Yeah. He picked cotton for a living. So I'm the only black male G to not pick cotton for a living, because my father did, his father Ernest did, his father Oscar did, and his father Henderson was a slave. When I had that meeting, I didn't think just that, wow, they're white. I'm thinking they're probably oblivious to U.S. history, to have built this wealth and these businesses and this ownership on the backs of black people, and to really think that the American dream has worked for them. They worked really, really hard, and they were probably more fortunate than us because racism kept us down. No, that slavery system and my family members kept us down.
Yeah.
So let me come back to asking you and John
Sure.
a question. So what is this like for you? I mean,
to actually be meeting family?
Well, I'm atypical, I think, I have to say, for the South and the whole family. You know, I grew up with parents who were just incredibly bigoted, racist. And I was the same thing, because as a child, you just parrot what you hear your parents say. I had my great moment of discovery about the time I was a senior in high school. I've been a yellow dog Democrat ever since. So it's very fulfilling for me to meet you people and find that we're just all folks and we've got a lot in common, much more so than I do with all of my white relatives. I mean, there weren't a lot of Hillary votes out there in the family. They're all Trump people. So it's great to me. Open up this whole new vista.
I was waiting for something to happen that never happened, which was the white people bring up slavery, or at least to talk about how Henderson was conceived. They never brought up slavery. I was like...
Well, when do white people ever bring up slavery, other than to be sorry that it happened to someone else? I think to bring up slavery in the context of their family, to somehow connect their ability to have a formal education or the life that they do, I still don't know if they made the connection between who they are and how they became who they are. Mm-hmm. The wealth that was afforded them, the opportunities. I think, one, it's too painful. Two, it's too embarrassing. And it feels so distant. But I wouldn't have my last name were it not for slavery. Right. And so I never expected them to bring it up. And in the first meeting, I wasn't sure how ready I was.
So 2 days ago, just 2 days ago,
sure,
I called John Harkin up on the phone, your cousin. We only talked for like 10 minutes, but I'll play a little snippet of this conversation because I asked him this.
Sure.
Good morning, Harkins Flores. This is John.
John, this is Charles from To the Best of Our Knowledge. How are you, sir?
Okay.
Are you ready to chit-chat about family history?
I am indeed.
You met your G relatives that were descendants of Henderson G. How did it feel to meet them?
It was just a wonderful coming together. Beautiful people. And I had only heard a few months earlier of Henderson.
You and Alex G seem to have connected, and you have such a powerful history together. Have you ever thought about what it'd be like if you had switched places? I mean, what if you were the descendant of Henderson and he was the descendant of Robert? Have you ever considered that?
I would be a very angry person.
Why do you think you'd be angry?
The injustice of it all.
I'm looking at the pictures, amazing photographs of Robert, your G descendant, and of Henderson, Alex's G descendant. And I look at these two photos, and I can't help but just see pain and American history and privilege. When you look at these photographs now, how do you see these two photographs?
I see more of the commonalities than the distinction. I don't, on the surface, see black-white as this irreparable chasm. When Alex and I sit down and we spent the whole day together, I found more commonality than a situation where people are not able to deal with each other.
Alex, Reverend G, what about you? Do you feel commonality looking at those photographs? You know, it must have been a moment driving back in the car maybe where you're like, oh, I wonder what it would have been like if I was a descendant of the other brother, of the white brother, and still a G. Did you even think about that?
Mm-hmm. I often think that if my accomplishments, I'm a published author, things I've started, created a nonprofit, created a movement, if I were white doing what I'm doing, I'd be a hero. And so, yeah, I think that if I were RL's great-great-great-grandson, given some of the resources that they were given, there are days where I would think, man, I could be a U.S. senator today. I could be the president of a university. And then I'll flip and think, but but I'm only 54. And I'm Henderson's great-great-grandson. And I can still do that stuff and not attribute it to being white and privileged. I've got something inside me that's allowed me to catch up. My daughter's a preemie, and the nurse told us to sort of watch it because preemies always feel the need to catch up. Like they know that their development is delayed, but there's an internal mechanism that just makes them just want to catch up, crawl, walk, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like a cultural preemie, like something inside me just looked around and said, you know what, I got to be the fastest, I got to be the strongest, and I've got to show that what people think about me and people who look like me is not true. And I feel like sitting at John's table, that preemie paused and said, you know what, maybe I've caught up.
Maybe caught up.
But to sit there as a Black man and feel like I don't have to play catch up was redemptive. That was worth the Ancestry.com fee. That was worth the flights down to New Orleans. But to sit there and say, I'm good. I left that meeting and that space feeling completely comfortable in my own skin and knowing that for no money in the world would I trade being Henderson's son for being RL's son. And for that, in some ways, Charles, that was all the reparation that table that Saturday in New Orleans could give me. And it was quite sufficient.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.